Chapter 35, Telling It Like It Is. Mother Jones was a pugnacious little woman and fearless. The worst things that could happen to a person had happened to her, so nothing else ever scared her. Her real name was Mary Harris Jones, and she was living in Memphis, Tennessee, when her children caught yellow fever. In those days, before modern medicines, yellow fever was a killer. Mary Jones's 4 boys died. Then her husband died. She was all alone. She got her courage together, moved to Chicago, and opened a dressmaking shop. Mrs. Jones had style, and she knew how to sew. She was becoming successful when in 1871, Chicago had a great fire. Some say Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over a lantern, and that started it. However it began, the whole city burned, and Mary Jones's business with it. She was left with nothing. That decided her. If she was going to start over again, she wanted to do something important with her life. She wanted to help others. It was children she worked hardest to help. Mother Jones was tiny, about 5 feet tall, with white hair. It turned white after her children died. She was called Mother because she seemed like a nice old lady until she opened her mouth. She swore like a trooper, had the energy of a battalion, and spoke in ear-splitting tones. Clarence Darrow, a famous lawyer, wrote of her, "Mother Jones's fearless soul always drew her to seek the spot where the fight was hottest and the danger greatest." She wanted people to know of the plight of child workers, so she marched a group of young mill workers from Pennsylvania to New York. Most prosperous New Yorkers had never seen a mill child. "The toll of these children makes others wealthy," she explained. "Here is a textbook on economics," Mother Jones said as she introduced little James Ashworth to a crowd. James's back was bent from carrying 75-pound factory loads. "He gets $3 a week, working in a carpet factory 10 hours a day." Then she introduced Gussie Ragno, a little girl from whom all the childhood has gone. Gussie, whose tired face was like an old woman's, packed stockings all day long, day after day, summer, winter, spring, and fall. Some people don't want to learn about unpleasant things. The police called Mother Jones a public nuisance. They arrested her. When the judge asked who gave her a permit to speak on the streets, she said Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams. Mother Jones was sent to jail more than once. In jail, she spoke of George Washington as a gentleman agitator who had fought the powerful English establishment. Each time Mother Jones got out of jail, she went right back to speaking out for workers. "I'm not a humanitarian," she said. "I'm a hellraiser." Actually, she was both. And she was very good at getting attention. Mother Jones made people think about America's working children. Here is part of what she wrote after going into a cotton mill in Alabama where she worked along with the children. Little girls and boys, barefooted, walked up and down between the endless rows of spindles, reaching thin little hands into the machinery to repair snapped threads. They crawled under machinery to oil it. They replaced spindles all day long. All night through, 6-year-olds with faces of 60 did an 8-hour shift for 10 cents a day. The machines built in the North were built low for the hands of little children. At the lunch half hour, the children would fall to sleep over their lunch of cornbread and fat pork. They would lie on the bare floor and sleep. Sleep was their recreation, their release, as play is to the free child. These children weren't slaves, but they might as well have been. This was another form of servitude. Something needed to be done. Laws were needed to keep children in school. Laws were needed to make working conditions safe for all workers. And there was something else besides working conditions that needed regulating. It was the products themselves. Since there were no laws to prevent it, some meat packers put dangerous spoiled meat in hot dogs. Some manufacturers built toys that could hurt children. There were no laws about these things because in the early days, people bought meat from a butcher they knew. Toys were usually made at home. Now, with big factories and modern transportation, people were buying things made far from their homes. Mother Jones wasn't the only one concerned. Writers were writing about the problems of unregulated business. Theodore Roosevelt called those writers muckrakers because they raked up muck and told people about it. They were important. You can't clean up muck unless you know where it is. Eventually, laws were passed to protect children and make going to school compulsory. A Pure Food and Drug Act helped make our food safe. It was those who shouted out like Mother Jones who made those laws happen. The militant, not the meek, shall inherit the earth, said Mother Jones. What did she mean by that? Inferno in Chicago. It was October 8th, 1871, and Mrs. O'Leary left a kerosene lantern in her hay-filled barn on DeKoven Street. The cow kicked, the barn began blazing, and there was no stopping the flames. Chicago, a city of mostly wooden buildings squeezed together, quickly became an inferno. By morning, 18,000 buildings were gone. The fire is said to have reached 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Buildings of fireproof masonry melted away. Cast iron buildings churned liquid. 90,000 people out of a population of 300,000 were left homeless. The Chicago fire killed 250 people. Few people know that on the same day, a fire in the forests of northern Michigan and northeastern Wisconsin killed between 1,200 and 2,400 people. Bread and roses, too. Officially, they were the industrial workers of the world, but everyone called them Wobblies. Wobblies thought that all workers, not just skilled workers, should be in unions together. Their idealistic goal was one big union. All workers belonged to it, and they'd have one big strike that would stop everything, and the workers could take over and make the country a better place. The Wobblies hated Sam Gompers's American Federation of Labor. AFL members were skilled workers, the aristocrats of the working world, and not everyone was welcome. The Wobblies were democratic. Any worker could join. Utah's William Big Bill Hayward opened the Wobblies' founding convention in Chicago in 1905 when he proclaimed in his booming voice, "Fellow workers, this is the Continental Congress of the Working Class." Another important Wobbly founder was Eugene Debs, a lanky railroad man from Indiana. Later, Debs became head of the Socialist Party, was sent to prison for opposing World War I, ran for president from jail, and got more than 900,000 votes. Yet another Wobbly was Father Thomas J. Haggerty, a Catholic priest who had fought some battles for Mexican railroad workers. Haggerty said, "The working class and the employing class have nothing in common," which didn't leave a whole lot of room for working out problems together. In Lawrence, Massachusetts, early in the year 1912, the Wobblies had their finest moment. When the Massachusetts legislature passed a law saying that women and children were not allowed to work more than 4 hours a week, the owners of the Lawrence textile mills speeded up their machinery so the workers would produce as much in 54 hours as they had in 56. The workers had to work faster to keep up, but they didn't get paid more for their work. In protest, some Polish women left their looms. Before long, 25,000 mill workers had walked off the job. Most were foreign-born. Among them, they spoke about 45 different languages. Many of the workers had come to Lawrence after reading advertisements in their native lands telling of opportunities in the mills. One poster showed a Lawrence working man leaving the factory with a suitcase full of gold. When they got to Lawrence, they found that their pay barely kept them from starving. They wanted more than just barely enough to eat, so they picketed with big signs that said, "We want bread and roses too." But they didn't have a real leader, so they appealed to the IWW for help. Big Bill Haywood was soon on his way east. He had no trouble communicating with gestures and sign language and his big heart. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, a slim, pretty Irish dynamo, came too. She had started as a strike leader for the Wobblies when she was only 16. And 26-year-old Joe Eltor, the son of an Italian immigrant family, took a leading role. He was a terrific organizer and spoke Italian and English fluently, with enough Polish, Hungarian, and Yiddish to get by. Eder tried to keep the workers calm. He said to them, "You can hope for no success on any policy of violence. Violence means the loss of the strike." There was violence at Lawrence, police violence. Strikers were the victims. Militia, special policemen, and Pinkerton detectives were brought to the city. Dynamite was discovered, strikers were arrested, and newspaper headlines screamed of anarchy. But it was soon found that the dynamite had been planted by the son of a former mayor, trying to frame the strikers. One evening, a group of strikers found themselves surrounded by armed police. A shot rang out, and Annie Lopeza fell dead. Joe Eder and IWW poet Arturo Giovannitti were arrested for the murder, although they were 2 miles away at the time. They were kept in jail for months and kept out of their leadership roles. Newspapers and magazines covered the strike. People all over the country began reading about Lawrence. Most Americans hadn't known about conditions in the mills. Some offered to care for strikers' children. People's hearts were going out to the Lawrence workers. On the 43rd day of the strike, 40 children and their parents were gathered at the Lawrence Railroad Station. The children had been invited to Philadelphia, where families had arranged to adopt them until the strike was over. Suddenly, the police appeared. A Boston newspaper reported what happened. Police, acting under orders of the city marshal, choked and knocked down women and children, the innocent wives and babies of the strikers. That was too much. Congress investigated. President William Howard Taft, whose wife attended the congressional hearings, ordered an investigation of industrial conditions. Finally, the mill owners agreed to raise wages, pay overtime, and rehire the strikers. The bread and roses strike was over.